Hi, in this screencast I'm going to attempt to explain to you the differences between a polar molecule and a nonpolar molecule and how you can look at a Lewis structure and figure out if it's polar or not. Polarity is when you have an uneven distribution of electrons. So we have uneven electrons. For instance, if you look at HCl, and we know that we have a single bond and we have these lone electrons on just the chlorine. When you look at this molecule, this is a polar molecule. This is polar because the electrons are not evenly distributed and there is no symmetry. Oh, it didn't write. There we go. There is no symmetry. You would represent this molecule with an arrow pointing towards the majority of the electrons. So this bond in between hydrogen and chlorine here is shown with the arrow below it. The positive end is toward the side with less electrons, and the point of the arrow is toward the side with the majority of the electrons. So the chlorine side has all the electrons and the hydrogen is basically bare. This creates a partial negative charge on the chlorine side and a partial positive charge on the hydrogen side. When you have many hydrochloric or HCl molecules in a beaker, they will orient themselves so that they can have the negatives and the positives all lined up to create a sort of a magnetic field, or what's called a bond. You have intermolecular attractions between the hydrogen here and this chlorine here, because this is a positive and this is a negative, and they are attracted to each other. So when you have an even distribution of electrons, this would be called nonpolar. And an example of that would be when you have the two oxygen molecules bonded to each other and they each have lone pair electrons and they have a symmetry. You can see that on the left side you have 4 dots and on the right side you have 4 dots, as well as on the top you have 4 dots and on the bottom you have 4 dots. So this is an even symmetry. The electrons are being shared evenly throughout the entire molecule, so there is no unevenness of the charge, and they will all have an equally the same charge. So when you have, when you look at a Lewis structure, if you have the electrons evenly distributed around the whole molecule, like they are in this case, this is nonpolar. All right, so there are 2 ways to figure out if something is polar. Number 1, you can draw the Lewis structure. And if you look at the Lewis structure and you have even distribution of electrons, well then that is nonpolar. And if you have uneven electrons, that is polar. So that's the easiest way, I think, to figure out if something is polar, is just draw the Lewis structure and look at the dots. The second way is to compare electronegativities. And when you do that, sorry, hold on. It's a long word. And it's probably not spelled right. So when you compare electronegativities, if you have something that when you subtract their 2 electronegativities, if the value is 0.3 or lower, that is going to be considered nonpolar. And if you have something between 1.7 to 0.3, that will be polar. If their electronegativities, when you subtract them, the value falls in there. Now remember, if you have 1.7 and higher, that would be considered ionic, and that is not going to be polar or nonpolar. These 2 are both covalent, and that's how we can decide. You know, you can only decide if something is polar or nonpolar if it's a covalent bond.